we are wasting the energy equivalent of 2/3 of Europe's annual electricity consumption by just burning a flame. And that's still we're not gonna be off oil in 20 years. It's not, let's be realistic.
Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today we're speaking with Andreas Lehner, the co-founder of PowerBlocks, a company developing methane capture projects where they are using existing technology to turn flared methane into energy. That energy is used to power data centers or Bitcoin mining. This extra revenue stream creates an incentive to abate the methane emissions, which are roughly 80 times more negative for the atmosphere than carbon. And in this conversation, we covered how to build an MVP with a hardware climate solution, how to win a pilot project, finding advisors from the industry that you are targeting. We discussed whether or not AI should be allowed to touch the energy grid, and then we also talked at the end about how he stays focused on one project. Overall, really, really fun episode with Andreas. So we hope you enjoy the show. All right, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
Good. Thanks for having me, Silas. Happy to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you calling in from Europe. Obviously, do these shows on Saturdays for people who the time zones don't line up for my evening time. So really excited to have you on. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. Let's just start with kind of a quick background on yourself and kind of what you're doing today.
Sure. I'm originally from Austria. I've been quite interested in sustainability for quite a while now, 15 years. Lived 10 years in Sweden and currently living in Spain, in Barcelona. So I've been around a little bit. My background is a lot in the energy space. I studied sustainable energy. I worked in solar energy myself before. I had my first startup the last 8-9 years, focusing on investing in solar energy in emerging markets, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. And over a year ago, I started to go back to the drawing board and start another business idea, which I'm sure we're gonna dive into a little bit more.
Yeah, certainly. And I guess what I'd like to do at the beginning here is just, could we get an explanation of what you're working on today in a very, very simple way, as if you were explaining it to your grandma or something like that?
Sure. What we're looking at is emissions that are being wasted in places where there's no value of the energy content of these emissions. And we're coming in and actually taking these emissions, turning them into electricity, and then monetizing them via data centers that are connected to the cloud via a satellite link. So we're basically making money out of something that wasn't valuable before. And what that emission is methane emissions, or I think in the US it's methane. I'm always getting a bit confused with the pronunciation of that. And it has a huge climate impact by just burning it. But it's not being done because it's not valuable on those places. So we're burning it and we're making money out of it, therefore enabling the actual abatement of the methane emissions on these sites.
Mm-hmm. And methane, obviously, if most people listening probably know this, but just for people aware, methane is significantly worse than just standard carbon emissions. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, methane has been overlooked a little bit because we always talk about CO2 and carbon emissions, and that's been the main focus. And it's been a very good focus because it is the major source of emissions, but a third of greenhouse gases comes from methane sources. And methane is so potent because it has a different chemical structure. So depending on your time horizon, it can be up to 80 times more potent in capturing heat versus CO2. So that's one thing. It's a lot more potent. It is less amount of time in the atmosphere. So that's the advantage against CO2, but we're running out of time. So our time preference is getting smaller and smaller. Therefore, if you look at a 10-year horizon, anything that we can do in 10 years is going to be valuable. And on the 20-year horizon, methane is 80 times worse than CO2. The other thing is that it's been increasing the most out of all greenhouse gases in the last decades, partially because we haven't really targeted it. So we have a problem where it's actually increasing multiples over CO2 emissions, for example. And it's very easy to abate. I mean, we just burn it in a gas turbine, right? It's not very difficult technology.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel. Yeah. Okay, cool. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a bit more. But I am also curious in the beginning kind of things. How have you talked a little bit at the start. Have you always been interested in climate, or what specifically got you interested to pursue this space and be involved in it?
Yeah, I mean, I actually got exposed to your own Al Gore and his first documentary ages ago. That was when I was still in high school, and I watched his first documentary as part of a high school assignment. I think we had to summarize videos, and I picked that documentary just randomly. I didn't even have a reason to pick it. And when I watched it the first time, I'm sitting in the living room with my dad and watching it on the projector. I was really shocked, and especially because nobody really talked about it, at least at that time, and not in my hometown, which is like a 10,000 people town in Austria. And somehow I watched it another time with my dad, and I was like, I want to do something in this area. That was when I was 16, 17. And that's how I got into the climate change area. It's a very broad subject, so I didn't really know what to do, but I was like, I want to do something against this craziness that is happening all around us. Apparently, nobody's looking at it. And then I studied a lot of different things in that direction: sustainable energy systems, energy transport, environmental management. I worked with an energy utility in Norway, moving them into solar, and basically got exposed to a lot of different angles of that sustainability space. And over taking a lot of loops and hoops, I figured out I want to work on the energy part, because everything we do, initially I was interested in electric mobility, but everything we do depends on the energy mix that we're doing it on. Therefore, that's kind of the underlying baseline of everything.
So you basically from a very early age decided that you were going to be involved, and it sounds like you were essentially involved in this from very early stages. Was there any at that time, was it difficult to find ways to be involved in the space? Did you have other mentors that you learned from, and how did you go about that in your early career days?
I mean, it was difficult to find an angle where you say, okay, this is the part that I want to work on, because again, sustainability and climate change is a very broad subject, right? I wouldn't say there has been particular mentors in the function of a traditional mentor, but there's been people along the way that just nudged me with little things into the right directions. Like friends of mine, they were like, "Oh, you should probably." I had to decide between engineering and management, and a friend of mine was like, "You should study engineering, because the management stuff you learn when you need it, like business schools. You don't need to do this now. You that's if you understand the engineering part, the business stuff comes with experience." So that was definitely a moment. And then obviously some professors at university, and people that showed me that entrepreneurship is a viable route, because that's the second piece of the puzzle, right? Working in climate change was the initial thing, but actually doing my own startup or work in the role of an entrepreneur wasn't very clear. But also working as an intern at a startup at some point exposed me to that. And a friend of mine that I worked with in Norway, um, his brother worked with solar in Western Africa, so that was kind of inspiring as well. So it was more indirectly through people that I met, and then also like reading a lot of books and having my mentors probably more in the types of people that I listen to and the types of books that I read, more than a person in my life, which it's still something I would like to reach at some point, like a person that you can have these conversations with, because it's a more one-directional relationship when you read your stuff in books. But it's been more that so far in my life.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. We'll talk maybe a little bit about AI today, but there's a lot of discussion about AI right now. everywhere you turn. And it just, to me, it's interesting to see that there's still that human aspect. Like you were inspired by Al Gore's work, to kind of like get that initial interest, and then you had these people who maybe just maybe wasn't in depth mentoring, but they gave you some pointers here and there, which really shapes our lives, right? And I think that this human aspect is really interesting in everybody's story to see how they develop, who really makes an impact. Because we all have these
Mm.
people who it could just be in passing or some stranger you meet, but there can be a really big impact on the way that your life changes because of what they say, right? So
Mm.
it's really interesting. I appreciate that. Um, Going back to the technology, where can you use this technology? You talked about methane and how there's a lot of increasing methane emissions. Where are these locations found?
So most of what we are targeting are concentrated emissions. So it's not, for instance, the rice field that emits methane because it's very hard to capture that. It's places like landfills where they capture the methane already. It's oil and gas sites that are flaring methane as it comes as a byproduct of their oil extraction, for example. It's anaerobic digesters on farms that take the manure and make it into fertilizer, and a byproduct of that is methane as well. Those three areas are the key three areas where we would see an application of what we're doing.
Okay, got it. And so are those you mentioned a number of different technologies that are kind of having a byproduct. Are those locations or projects increasing in number? Or I mean, I don't know how it is in Europe, and I know that some of these things are probably tightly regulated in the US. I'm not sure. Is this something that's growing a lot?
So it depends on the sector, right? Landfills in Europe have been targeted for quite a while. It's still a problem, especially in Western Europe, in Spain. That's why I'm in Spain to some extent, and in Eastern Europe. Those are kind of places where you still have a lot of landfilling going on. The EU has a directive that we should landfill as little as possible, but we will still have landfills. Even if we stop tomorrow, those landfills emit methane over a 15 to 20-year
Mm-hmm.
time horizon. So they will still emit methane in a time horizon that is relevant for our goals of fixing the climate and the greenhouse gases. Oil and gas flaring, I mean, for sure, at some point, hopefully, we'll have not as much oil production as we have today because we need to stop doing that. But it's still there, and we are wasting the energy equivalent of 2/3 of Europe's annual electricity consumption by just burning a flame. And that's still we're not gonna be off oil in 20 years. It's not, I mean, let's be realistic. And then anaerobic digesters is probably the one source that's gonna be uh, the longest if you compare it on that. And that might also increase because if we find technologies that enable the anaerobic digestion to make sense, then like food monetization, like what we're doing, then we could do this on more farms than we do it today instead of emitting the methane and venting it into the air from the manure. So yeah, it's not skyrocketing, but we need to cut it. That's the
Mm-hmm.
point. Like,
I mean, that's interesting. I think, go back on that point you mentioned that if I heard this correctly, you said there's 2/3 of the equivalent of Europe's energy consumption is wasted just by being not captured.
in only oil and gas
Wow.
flaring. Yeah.
That's pretty crazy. So definitely an opportunity there. In terms of the monetization, you mentioned this is, you can take this and actually make it valuable. So can you walk us through that process? How does this work in a little bit more detail? Break down the different components and how who makes the money? How does it work, etc.
Sure. I mean, so we start with a methane source. Let's say a landfill, right? Landfills emit methane for 15 years minimum, actually up to 40 years, but it declines over time. So you have infrastructure on the landfill that captures the gas from the garbage in pipes. Methane goes the easiest way, like most gases. So when there is a pipe that is free, it just goes in there and you pump it out of the landfill. So then you have a methane gas, which is a bit dirty. It's not the cleanest gas, so you need a bit of a cleaning step. So you clean certain gases out that are part of the landfill because there's a lot of things in landfills, and you cannot burn all of these gases in a gas turbine because they might destroy your gas turbine. So the second stage is a cleaning, a gas preparation kind of stage. And then you compress it and you run it through gas turbine. So far it's pretty straightforward, and a lot of this has been done in Europe. So landfill gas to electricity projects. You run a gas turbine, which basically runs on natural gas. I mean, methane from landfills is basically the same as natural gas. It's just less pure. And you burn the methane to 99.99%. You produce CO2 in the process, which is a greenhouse gas. It's much less potent, and at a certain scale, you could capture it if you want to. But basically, you have a gas turbine that produces electricity. The standard so far has been that electricity then gets fed into the grid, and you make money doing that. And a lot of countries like UK, Germany, Austria have been quite good in Europe doing that. But you cannot do that when you are too far away from the grid, or your size doesn't justify the investment in a big enough infrastructure, or you have other problems. Like in Spain, you don't get permits for more than 5 years to operate the landfills, so you don't know if you're going to be there in 5 years, so you don't want to invest in infrastructure that needs 15 years to be there, to be paid off, like a grid connection. So then you have the problem that that electricity wouldn't be used. So you don't do all of this, what I just said, because you're never going to get your investment back, because nobody wants to buy your electricity. And that's where we come in. So then basically what we do is we plug in a 40-foot container next to the gas turbine, plug it directly into the gas turbine or the electricity outlet of the gas turbine, and run a data center with that electricity. Why a data center? Well, because it's completely location independent, because we can run it on a satellite internet connection like Starlink. So we don't need all of that external infrastructure piece. It's movable. So if you lose your permit in 5 years, we move it to the next site and you do the same there, no problem. Most sites in Europe are flaring already, so the capturing infrastructure is already there, so nothing to worry about investing into that one on the next site. And then we, like I said, we run a data center. What's the specialness about the data center? It's not Amazon or Netflix. It's batchable cloud computing. What is batchable cloud computing? Basically, it's computing where most of the work is done on the server, not on the connection to the cloud. So Netflix streaming, most of the work and the value is done streaming the video into the cloud, which means you need like super fast internet speeds. When most of your work is done on the server, the internet speed is less of a problem because you just need really high processing power, GPUs, for example. And what's the application there? Like one is AI machine learning or graphic rendering, very heavy computing. Another one is proof of work cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, where it's calculation based. All of the work is done on the server and the data packages are really small. Those are kind of probably the main applications initially. And then we also see obviously as a, it's not really the technology, but there's a carbon credit element as well to this because we're offsetting methane. But the main element is AI machine learning, graphic rendering, and Bitcoin mining.
One thing really quickly there's a couple of things I want to talk about is one, you mentioned that this is in particular your solution is for remote situations, right? Where you can't necessarily connect to the grid. Are there a lot of these out there, and are these the ones that are just kind of like completely left to nobody's doing anything about them?
Depends on the country, but in Spain there's a lot of sites that don't do anything with it. They're just flaring it like on oil and gas sites.
Okay.
So they're not doing anything with it. In the US, obviously widespread country, a lot of landfills are super far away from the grid. The same if you do anaerobic digestion on a farm, you normally are not the closest to the grid. And even if you are close to a grid, the interconnection costs you money. The grid often has a limitation of how much electricity it can get into. So some of the landfills we're talking with, they could produce a lot more electricity, but the grid connection is limited to, let's say, I mean, just a number like 100 kilowatts, but they could produce 500. So they're flaring the equivalent of 400 and just feeding into the grid whatever they can. So that's kind of a curtailment issue, which we can also fix. Then it's not necessarily the most remote location. And oil and gas flaring is done on super remote locations.
Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. If you made it this far, it's likely that you're enjoying the show, so I wanted to ask your help. If you're enjoying it, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share with somebody in the same industry who might find this interesting. And if you're interested in getting summaries of these episodes, go subscribe to our newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn and Substack. Links can be found in the description. Thanks for your help in growing the reach of this show. Got it. Okay. The second thing I wanted to just touch on really quickly is this idea. A lot of people are not a fan of bringing crypto at all into this kind of in the sustainability picture. Could you maybe just talk about, why do people have this opposition to it, and what is your take on it?
Yeah, it's a very polarized space, huh? I think the world is generally more polarized nowadays than it was. But Bitcoin, let's as an example, and climate is not always the most friendly relationship. It's very polarized, especially on the climate side. And it's interesting. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I found it interesting, because whenever there's a polarized topic or there's some version of dogmatism involved, I believe that the truth that you read is probably not the truth in reality. So yeah, a lot of people that I've talked with in the climate space, when they hear Bitcoin, it's like, oh, we don't like it. And one element is not believing in the story behind Bitcoin, or believing it's a very volatile asset, which is totally valid. It's a volatile asset as an income stream. But then the other assumption being like, oh, it uses a lot of energy, is very subjective. Yeah, sure, if the energy is a coal power plant, it's maybe not a great use, but it always depends on what energy you use. And I think there's a little bit of that thinking of idealism, that any use of energy we have has great use cases for humanity, which is not always the case. I'm just thinking about Christmas lightning, when a whole house is glowing in the night because of Christmas lights. Yeah, the question of humanity's value out of that is maybe also very subjective, right? So I agree with the idea that we shouldn't use dirty fuels or dirty energy like coal for things like this. I believe there is a value behind Bitcoin outside of that, but that's a different conversation. But if you use energy that is being wasted and actually a problem for the climate, and you have an off-taker in the shape of let's say Bitcoin mining, you can actually use it as it is. It's a tool, and tools are only as good or as bad in the way that you use them. And if you use them in a way where you can monetize assets and energy that is being wasted until today, because that type of off-taker hasn't existed before, then you look at a very interesting space. And then the argument that is currently out there doesn't really hold true anymore. And there's a lot of areas where you can play around with that. Like there's also people that look at Bitcoin mining, for example, with renewable energy, because you can maybe oversize your renewable energy assets and get a stable offtake for any excess. So you remove volatility out of the grid, instead of just doing it with batteries, which is super expensive, and only have a certain time frame. I mean, a few hours of grid consumption at the best. So I would say, whenever there's dogmatic thinking, take a step back and see where that
Mhm.
dogmatism might be broken, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, it's in particular you mentioned it being a tool, right? If you can take it and use it as a way to monetize something that previously there was no incentive to really do so, I mean, why not, right? That's definitely we're achieving a goal of kind of reducing the emissions there, and it's funded by, in part this thing. And I think that these creative financing models are really, really vital in order to continue to grow different kind of innovation in the climate tech space. Um, let's go into, I don't want to get too far into that. I want to go into the kind of the process of how you got started. So once you came up with this idea, can you walk us through how you validated it? What were the steps that you took to kind of decide, what, I'm going to go forward with this? Because this is not, you're not just spinning up a software and kind of selling it to the world. How does that work?
Yeah, well, and initially version one of our idea was actually focused on a very different segment, which was Africa and renewable energy in Africa, and using this as a tool to monetize big energy projects. That we validated by having a lot of customer conversations and then financial modeling and realizing this doesn't make sense, partially because you don't have enough uptime for your assets, like you're running them maybe 1/3 of the day, or if you're happy, if you're lucky, half of the day. So then we pivoted and met a few people along the way, and we realized, yeah, methane is actually an interesting way of looking at this, and partially because it solves the problem we've had in version one, which is an uptime problem. With methane, you don't have that. You can run everything 80 to 90% of the time. So that was the initial thinking. And then it was really the same story again, slightly slower, because the industry is a bit, I wouldn't say more, yeah, a mix between more guarded and just slow in itself. From the landfill industry is what I'm talking about. So we talk to customers in UK, in Spain, like waste management companies, landfill gas consultants. Just also validating, we know that this is a problem in the US. There's companies that do this in the US or try to do this. Is it a problem in Europe? And we realized it is. It's a slightly different problem, but it's definitely there, and people got interested for different reasons. And that was for us the validation that we're still working on it while we're talking here at the same time. We're still talking to landfill companies trying to get our first project. But that was the validation that we needed, because we know the financial side makes sense as long as we have enough uptime. And we know we're using a waste product. So the energy source is also really cheap versus what we looked at before. So we have identified a few problems before, and all of these problems are kind of checked off in the new iteration. Now it's just making sure that we actually get over the finish line with one of the customers that we're talking with.
Mhm. And so when you're trying to get a pilot like this, what are they typically looking for? What is the standard objections? Then you maybe pull some other data together. Like, what does it really take to get one of these things on the ground, and then you can go prove it?
I mean, like you said, it's not software, right? So there's a hardware element. One is like proving that you can build it, which we have put the team together, a mix of us in the company and external advisors and subcontractors, to ensure that we can actually deliver the project in its entirety. That's really the main piece. And then obviously they want to know how much money they can make out of it. I mean, the one advantage that we're having for our first project, we're probably going to finance the majority of it ourselves. Ourselves, with investors that we have lined up that want to finance it, right? So that removes a big question that normally comes up quite quickly, because then there's hardly a risk for them. At least a very low risk. And then the idea is to prove this with one customer. We have one customer in Spain with over 100 landfill sites. Prove it on one, show them that this works, that they can make revenue out of it, that they can cut their costs, and then scale it with them afterwards. But the main thing is like deliverability and making sure that we can put it on the ground.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting to hear. I mean, I can imagine these are usually pretty large companies that aren't just going to be like, oh yeah, we'll give it a shot. You know, they have a lot of due diligence they have to do and make sure that it's there. I guess just from like for yourself, like a mental perspective, like obviously you're not going to execute everything yourself. There's going to be some contractors involved with some of the execution. Like, how do you in your mind say, hey, you know, like there's some risk here, of course. Like, how do you kind of mentally deal with the fact that there are some risks personally, and how it could go wrong or go well? How do you deal with that? And as you're kind of building something new and going towards this vision of something that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is having advisors that have experience, like we have on our advisory board. One person that has a really solid background on the data center side, and another person that has a 40-year background on the landfill gas to electricity side. I think he was part of the first landfill gas electricity projects in the UK when they started 40 years ago. Because obviously we want to make sure that what we're looking at makes sense before we go down the actual construction route. And through these people, you get in touch with companies and contractors that you can trust, more or less. I mean, I trust our advisory board in that. I think the mindset of an entrepreneur often is take risks and you will figure it out along the way. So part of it is really also just being open to take the risks and not overthink it, but have the people there that can enable us to deliver the best quality we can do. We're working with contractors that have done this for decades, and this same on the data center side. So I actually have, I mean, obviously operating and installing stuff will always have its hurdles, and it might take longer than we think. So those are the bigger risks. But the thing is, like, what we're doing to a huge extent is business model innovation more than deep tech or kind of new energy technology. So there's less of a technology risk. So I'm not that worried about the technology itself. It's more an execution piece, and I think for the execution we have the right people in the co-founding team and in the advisory board.
Yeah, one thing just really quickly to touch on would be how when you mentioned you have these advisors, people who are really well versed in the different areas. So it's kind of like more of a commodity. You're just kind of pairing together some existing industries. When you went to find these people, we don't have to talk about how you found them so much as how did you convince them to work with you? Is it difficult to convince some of these people to be like, hey, we're trying to do something totally new in the space that you're familiar with? Would you be part of us? Like, how do you convince them to be part of that?
Um, we didn't have to do a lot of convincing actually, and I think it's a bit serendipity because the landfill gas person we're working with, he has identified the problem that we're trying to solve decades ago. He's like, oh yeah, I've looked for a solution to this problem. We have never really found anything. So when we come along, he's like, this is interesting. Um, then the data center guy has had the idea to work on a similar kind of focus before. Like he finds the focus with methane that is quite interesting. So it's kind of like just finding the right people and them already understanding a good chunk of what you're trying to do and them getting excited about it um, themselves without us needing to convince them a lot, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, just finding the people who happen to have already been thinking about this problem. So to them, it's not you're not trying to convince them to change something because they've been in an industry for a long time. They're actually thinking actively about this problem. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, finding those people probably maybe I don't know if you found them quickly or if it took a long time, but you gotta get the right people. So be patient, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
Um, Are you just one last question on the model here? Are you planning to, in the long term, to fund all of these projects yourself? Like, are the project owners going to be taking the benefits from it? Are you going to split the revenue from, what you can achieve from the data versus the carbon offsets? Like, how is this going to look?
Yeah, so I think we see like a split in three phases. The first phase is us doing most of it. So financing and installing, operating, obviously with a certain level of subcontractors, to get experience ourselves in this segment and to see what works, what doesn't work, or what needs improvement. That's going to be probably relatively short. And in that period, we're probably going to develop some software and hardware that enables this interconnection between the gas electricity and the data center piece better. Then the idea is that we become probably more of a financing body where we pool projects together, finance them through like basically SPV finance projects, special purpose vehicles, and then get also again subcontractors to install most of this and then just operate it for the site owners. And then the last phase is, and that's a big question mark still. It's more like a vision than anything. It's like, okay, if we see that this is taking off, there's other companies coming in, they want to do what we're doing, which would be great because again, it's a lot of energy that needs to be converted. Maybe we can become more like an enabler for these companies than doing it ourselves. And that means then licensing out our software, hardware, giving them a know-how, a platform to enable the execution of these projects in a faster way. That includes like regulatory knowledge, like just pulling it all together. That's probably the last final phase. Also looking at the size of the problem, I don't think we're going to do all of it. So if we want to scale methane abatement, that's going to be the most relevant version. In terms of what's in it for the site owners, they basically on the one side, depending on the site, but let's assume for 1 second that they're flaring methane already and they're off the grid. They are using or they're spending money each year to run that flare with a diesel generator. So on the one side, you're cutting that cost to nearly zero, and that can be quite substantial. And then they get a revenue share from the operation or a PPA. So either they get paid for the gas, what we use in a PPA, but for gas, I mean, basically taking the solar PPA model and putting it on landfill gas, or they say, hey, we want to get a revenue or profit share, and then we share with them a certain percentage of the profit that is being done on the data center side. That then also depends on a little bit how much money they invest into the infrastructure versus other investors.
Mhm. Because you're doing this way, do you anticipate there being a pretty good path to using private equity rather than venture capital to get these projects to do kind of project financing?
Yeah, we're in this very interesting intersection between kind of project finance, infrastructure finance, and venture capital. But there's for sure play for private equity and project finance here. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Yeah, I wanna talk a little bit about AI. So this is something I'm really not super well versed on, but I'd be keen to just understand from your perspective, how is AI playing a role in what you guys do in the grid, anything, just kind of let's open up the discussion.
Sure. And I'm just going to note that I might not be the best first person on AI either myself, but what we are doing, I think there's two elements where we're going to touch on it. One is we're basically running a microgrid that needs to be managed and that needs a certain level of intelligence. I don't want to say it's going to be AI because a lot of buzzwords, but probably algorithm based because you need to prioritize certain things in that microgrid. If you have production that fluctuates, like it is the case with landfill gas, for example. So you need to turn on and off your custom or like your data center, certain parts and pieces. You might have a small battery that charges when there is too much gas coming out and you're overproducing electricity. So that needs a little bit of intelligence to prioritize. And you could even do that on a grid connected site to basically say, hey, with this tool set of the grid, the battery, the data center to monetize our electricity, which one at this hour of the day makes most sense economically, and then you turn on and off bits and pieces. In the data center itself, we're going to obviously touch AI because we might run AI algorithms or computers that do the calculations or the modeling, the machine learning stuff. But that will be, I mean, we won't touch the AI itself. We're just going to host the servers for companies that do this. So not going to be super involved, but obviously there will be more and more AI touching our energy infrastructure, the more complex it becomes. I mean, if you look at an equivalent being, for example, the stock market, I mean, the more complex the stock markets become, the more AI came in, and now it seems like it's bots trading against bots sometimes. And with more and more energy sources that are intermittent, it becomes more and more challenging to balance the consumption with the production. So at some point, you want to automate as much as possible because we cannot think on quick seconds sometimes, and a lot of this is already being done, right? So there will for sure be an element for the grid. How that's going to look like and how exactly that's going to work, I don't think I'm in a place to dive into. It's more like brainstorming than anything if we want to go there.
hmm Do you have any particular thoughts or concerns about a lot of people talk about the risks of AI, especially recently, and usually a prime example is AI touching the grid. Like, is that okay? Because it's very difficult. Like, obviously, the grid is extremely complicated, and we could you really use it, but at the same time, like it's a very critical infrastructure, right? And if there's something that kind of goes malicious, do you have any particular thoughts on that?
I mean, to the extent I've thought about this is I think we're talking a lot about AI and general uh, intelligence. We haven't really reached that yet. Most of the intelligence that we have is very niche. I mean, either it can write nice paragraphs or it can make nice pictures, right? Or it can try to drive a car, which is already quite complex for it, and hopefully it doesn't make an accident. We've been talking about getting there for many years, especially people like Elon Musk have. I mean, obviously, we shouldn't hand over full responsibility to a tool like this, but I think we can use it as a tool to humanity. I think there was this, I don't know if it was a book or podcast or video, I don't remember, where we believe that robots will take over the world. But I think what will happen is humans will continue working, but being supported by robots, and in this case, AI. So if you can make certain decision making faster with AI, and then still have the humans involved, I think that's probably going to be the better outcome out of the three, like humans only, AI and humans together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think it's something for me, spending a lot of time just doing my job and everything in the daytime. It tends to be, I feel a bit of FOMO from everybody kind of playing around with these new tools and figuring out how they work. It is interesting to see how massively impactful it can be to building something, to building a business, or just making your output as an individual significantly greater. It's like a very, very new learning curve. On that topic, are there any ways particularly that you utilize AI to help kind of make a bigger, maximize the effort that you put in? Like, is there anything that in this climate, building a hardware climate tech startup that you use it for?
Well, we're doing what a lot of people are doing these days, like writing stuff ChatGPT instead of writing it yourself. I guess this
Hmm.
is as far as we go with AI currently. Once we're building a software, which we're not doing yet, we want to do the first projects before we even dive into building the software product. We might touch it a bit more, but no, I mean, in the product itself, we're not really dealing with AI as of now.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I'm just kind of curious because I know that it's usually in the form of if you've got some really good engineers, maybe two or three people, they can, if they're really good at prompting and everything, they can build a software pretty easily, right? And run a
Mm.
company pretty easily, right? They can get customer service like what used to be maybe a 50-person company can maybe be 5 or 10, right? Because of the impact. So I think it has an interesting aspect on that side of how it interplays with venture capital. Maybe they won't need as much money to build businesses going forward. I'm just kind of curious to see how is that going to apply to more hardware related things, because
Mm.
climate has a lot of hardware, right? It really does. So I think it's a fascinating thing to think about, but I should maybe read some books on it because I'm very, very uneducated in that space. Um,
I mean, it depends on what kind of hardware you're doing, right? If you are doing things that need a certain level of R&D, there's for sure a play for AI to take a role in it, right? I mean, just modeling. I remember it's a bit not connected, but like this new model for propellers for drones that are super silent, and that was kind of partially done with AI because it goes through a lot of iterations of what kind of designs make the least air circulation, which basically then creates the noise of the drones. So there's definitely applications here. What we're doing is really, to a huge extent, a business model innovation, and there, yeah, I haven't seen ChatGPT being super smart yet to tell us exactly how we should operate, but
yeah,
we'll see. Open for it. I think it's going to be more on the software piece for us once we get to that stage. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Cool. And then I guess just so far in building the business, what would you say has been the biggest challenge so far?
So for the biggest challenge, from what we can control ourselves, has been getting into the landfill industry. So it's been a lot of hitting the head with the wall with the head, hitting the head on the wall. It's a bit of an incumbent industry. They want to do waste, and that's it. We have few really good leads now, but it's definitely been not the easiest industry to get into compared to other endeavors I've done before. And then the other one is, which is, I mean, partially in our hands, but maybe more the market sentiment right now is raising funding in this current market. Um, is definitely more challenging than it was in my first startup. I don't want to say it's super hard or super impossible because I don't think it is, but it's definitely harder than when I did it the last time.
Mhm. With one thing I've been always curious about is with stuff like this, that there's obviously some costs that go into running the company now, but I would assume, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, that it's largely just like having enough money to pay the people who are working there currently, and then finding these things, pulling the projects together, and then eventually you'll get a project ready, and then you'll go and get project financing for that, right? So like, are the costs from a venture capital perspective mostly just paying the individuals so that you can kind of live your life and continue going on and finding these projects?
I mean, that's always the biggest expenditure with most startups, right? Especially uh, especially in the software space, but also for us. I mean, we're gonna finance the first few installations partially ourselves, probably. So there is a bit of that element that we're gonna invest part of the equity that we're raising into capex. But yeah, most of the money goes into the team, as with every startup. That's at least mostly the biggest expenditure. We are currently putting in our sweat equity. So we don't have that problem yet, but it has a deadline as well at some point. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah, you can't work for you have to, you still have to pay the bills eventually, right?
Yeah.
Um, Very cool. And then I guess maybe wrapping up here a bit, what do you most excited for about the future of this industry and this technology? I mean, you've built another company in the past, and the space is a little bit different as well. So, like, what are you looking forward to?
I mean, I want us to be able to say it's like 7, 10 years from now that we have tackled the majority of our concentrated methane gas emissions and actually turned them into something useful, and also basically taken the methane out of the atmosphere, because that will move us a big step towards our 1.5 to 2 degree targets, and without it we can't achieve them. So just being able to have said that we've been enabling more of this, and also other people having jumped on this and seeing the interest in it, and it's happening now. I think it's funny enough, methane is currently becoming a thing that people look more at, more like due to it being highlighted in the IPCC reports, and more startups are targeting methane abatement in different versions. I think in 7, 10 years we will see a very different clean tech vertical that only focuses on methane, and hopefully that vertical will be part of it, and we can say that together with everybody else we've tackled a good majority of the problem.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that is exciting to think. I mean, it is very impactful, especially when you think you said it was 80% more, it has more 80% more negative impact on the environment than carbon emissions, correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to put it in different numbers, I worked in the solar industry before, and we compared methane abatement with a solar installation in the US with like one of the dirtiest grid mixes we can think of, and just see the comparison. And with the dirtiest grid being replaced by solar, we are still up at least 10 times more impactful from the CO2 offsetting perspective per kilowatt of project size, and the same per dollar invested. So that's been quite interesting for me to see, because I've always seen solar as one of the holy grails, and it's one of the bullets. This is not a holy grail either. We need to do everything, but it's definitely very impactful, and it's mainly because of what you mentioned, the potency of the methane on a 20-year time span.
Hmm. What one thing I just thought of to ask you that I think could be interesting, because this is not your first climate tech company, is you're obviously somebody who comes up with ideas and then actions on them to build companies. As you're doing this, I'm assuming you're thinking about other problems or you're noticing other problems. Two parts of this question. One, how do you deal with this? Like, oh, there's this other really cool problem. Maybe I should go work on that. How do you deal with that process? But also, what are some of those problems that maybe other people are thinking about, and it'd be kind of fun to put them out into the world to see if other people want to work on them?
Yeah, I mean, I believe in focus, so I try not to do more than one idea at the same time. I have a few friends that have the same problem, like you mentioned. Oh, I have so many ideas. What do I do? I like start with one and see where it goes. So I think we tend to overthink things, and I do that myself. But I think there is a beauty in action and seeing where things actually go. So that's kind of, I mean, if there's interesting things popping up, yeah, that's cool, but somebody else might do them. I don't believe in being the CEO of 5 companies. So that's one
Not
that's
you're
one
not
of
going to be
them.
the next Elon Musk.
No, I also want to have a life, and we mentioned this before we started. But being in Europe, we value our life quality as well outside of work. So I love working, and don't get me wrong, but I also value my friendships and kind of other things in my life. So I don't see myself working and sleeping on the industry floor. That's not my idea of being an entrepreneur. But anyway, um, I mean, I've explored 3 startup ideas in the last year and a half, but they were all phased. So it's kind of like how we are saying we're monogamous now, but it's actually serial monogamy, like one person at a time, but maybe several times, several people
Hmm.
in your lifetime. So I started looking at sharing economy. We all have a lot of stuff. Why can we not use the stuff that we have, and instead of buying stuff rented? That was the first idea that I explored once I left my previous startup. And then we explored the Africa sector, where there's a lot of need for energy, like there's a lot of energy poverty, and kind of seeing like, okay, well, what has been done so far? I've been working in an industry for a while. There needs to be a better way of doing it. And that was kind of the iteration one of this idea. Then we pivoted, which was like use data centers as a main offtake, install a huge solar installation in the middle of Africa, megawatt, use 900 kilowatts for data center, and then use 100 kilowatts for the village to electrify them and increase or improve the project economics of that installation by having a kind of industrial off-taker, which doesn't exist in Africa mostly. That didn't make sense because solar obviously only works when the sun is shining, and batteries is expensive still, especially in off-grid locations. But there's a company in Kenya that does this now, which is called Gridless Power, but they do it with hydro, and hydro makes a lot more sense because it's a base load. They got money from Block and amongst other investors, so it's definitely popping up. And now it's methane. I mean, there's a lot of ideas around methane, how to abate it on different sites, and I don't think we're going to be the only solution, but turning it into things. I mean, I think there will be a lot of ideas popping up. I don't have another one yet there, but those were the things that I've explored. And then once I'm onto one idea, it's very hard to get me off it. So I'm not really brainstorming a lot these days until we decide that we need to pivot or that something else happens.
Yeah, I think it's very respectable. I mean, I'm somebody who has struggles massively to stay on track with one thing for a very long time. And usually when I come up with some idea, I immediately reach out without really doing any due diligence. I just reach out to some people and chat about it. Hey, what do you think about this? Or how can we do that? Blah, blah, blah. And then sometimes I'm so active about it and I'm on to the next idea that by the time I actually have that meeting with somebody, I kind of forgot what the whole purpose of it was, all right, what the nuances were. But no, it's very respectable to be able to stay focused. I think it's something that's important. I just always am curious to hear because I think as you're solving new problems, you're also noticing, hey, what's going to be the problem beyond this, right? They're going to solve this thing, but then there's going to be this next wall we're going to run into, and I think that there's going to be a lot of those in the world as we continue to come up with these really cool solutions that in reality, like there's so much change happening. It's very uncomfortable for many people and especially for a lot of corporations. Like if you mentioned the idea of why not we just share the things we have? Of course, no, corporations don't want to that sell products. They don't want to sell less products, sell fewer products. So there's so many things that are going to change, and I'm just generally I'm an optimistic person. I'm very excited for the future. But yeah, so I guess final thing would be, what is your ask to the audience? Any final thoughts?
I mean, if there's anybody in the audience that is listening to this and finds it interesting, there's probably two asks that are quite relevant for us today. Maybe three asks. One is if you work in any industry related to what we discussed, so landfill, oil and gas, anaerobic digesters or other concentrated methane emissions, and you want to explore this together, shoot me a message or an email at andreas@powerblocks.co. If you are an investor that invests in early stage startups, we're raising a pre-seed of $500,000. Same, shoot me an email and we'll have a conversation. We're looking at closing our pre-seed before everybody goes on summer holidays, so around June time. And if you find this interesting for any other reason that I cannot think of yet, please do the same. Send me an email and I'm happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's always good for people to chat. I mean, this is why I'm a big fan of just building out in public and putting things out into the ether because you never know when somebody can really be helpful to you or you can be helpful to them in some way. So thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate this. This has been great.
Thanks, Silas. I appreciate it as well.
All right, have a great day.
You too. Cheers.